Welcome everybody to Go Local Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. It's December 26th. Hope everybody is having a great holiday season. Merry Christmas to all those yesterday. Happy Hanukkah. And off to the new year we go to Jennifer Lawless. She is the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, happy holidays.
Okay, let's jump right. Excuse me, I can't even utter it without coughing a little bit. Let's jump right to Matt Gaetz. I can't even remember what portion of the week it was. Beginning of this week, the House Ethics Committee came out and released their report on Matthew Gaetz, former congressman, once a nominee to be Attorney General under Donald Trump. That is, just to make sure everybody understands, that's a bipartisan commission, I believe, a committee, and it has the same number of Republicans and Democrats. Let's talk about that report. What did it say, and what does it mean?
There were no shocking allegations that were unfounded in the report, and there were no really strange results. It was exactly what had been speculated and what the investigators in Florida had suggested, which is that Matt Gaetz had sex with multiple women, some of whom, at least one of whom, was under the age of 18. He didn't ask her age. She didn't report her age. He also bought drugs illegally and gave them to these women at various parties. And that's among a list of behaviors unbecoming a member of Congress, and that the Ethics Committee finds in violation of congressional rules and ethics.
Does anything happen with it? Do Florida officials move forward with any type of review and potentially prosecution?
Probably not, because keep in mind, Florida law enforcement has already been investigating this. There are other people who have been part of this ring who have cooperated with the police and who are serving jail time. And so this really is more significant because it's likely the end of Matt Gaetz' political career. With this report out there, it's very, very difficult to see the Trump administration appointing him to a position. It's unlikely that he would ever get confirmed in the Senate. They could appoint him to something that doesn't require confirmation. It's unlikely that he could run for statewide office, whether that be Senate or governor in the future as well. So, he was a rising star within some facets and some, enclaves of the Republican Party, and this makes that very, very difficult. So I think it's more politically damning than legally damning for him.
That report was released on Monday. On Sunday, he spoke in front of a conservative conference, and he intimated that he might run for the United States Senate for the seat that Marco Rubio is likely to surrender in order to take the position of U.S. Secretary of State, or that he might run for governor in the future in Florida.
Well, he's got a better shot if he runs for governor than if he runs for the Senate, because with the House Ethics Committee report hanging there with a bipartisan, it's a bipartisan report from fellow members of Congress, it becomes very, very difficult to, even if he were to get elected to the Senate, to remain in the Senate. The Senate could then choose to expel him. The Senate could launch their own investigation into these charges and allegations. They could choose not to seat him on any committees. So I think a congressional career in either chamber is over. Obviously, it's different if he runs for statewide office. The Congressional Ethics Committee report doesn't apply to what goes on in the state of Florida or what standards Floridians hold their own elected officials to. But again, I think it's a really, really tough road, especially given that there are a lot of people in Florida who are politically ambitious and who don't find opportunities that often to run for higher office. Almost every person in the congressional delegation and the House delegation is obviously going to be eyeing that Senate race. And the other thing to keep in mind, too, is that Ron DeSantis makes an appointment in the meantime, and that person then basically has incumbency status.
One of the criticisms of the early stages of the Trump transition team was that they weren't vetting nominees particularly well. There was no FBI background checks, et cetera. It is my understanding, if I'm reading the reports correctly, that they have improved on that. But does this speak to that failure of going through the proper review in order to make a nomination?
Well, it does, except this is sort of a case that's a bit different in that you didn't need an FBI background check to know that this was coming out. So, this was in a lot of ways just a slap in the face to anybody who thought that Donald Trump was going to take seriously the nomination process. To nominate as Attorney General, who's the chief law enforcement official of the land, somebody who has violated not only, various laws, but also federal congressional ethics, is just perfect example of the fact that the Trump administration, and Donald Trump in particular, doesn't care about the rules and doesn't think that the rules or the rule of law applies to the people in his administration. So I also think that Matt Gaetz decided that he was going to resign from Congress so that the nomination would go through and the report would never be seen. He knew what was going to be in it. He resigned and took a risk and hoped that because he was no longer a sitting member of Congress, the committee would not release the report. And that was a bet that he lost.
Let's go back to late last week. The budget deal blew up. Elon Musk, especially, and Donald Trump as well, undercut the Republicans on the deal to fund the government and increase the spending cap. Then Johnson sort of cut back a deal with the Democrats. It all worked out. It was a big mess. Hard to tell who are the winners and the losers in this big financial budget battle.
Well, I think the American people won, at least in the short run, because there's not a government shutdown. And averting a government shutdown, especially during the holidays, is a good thing. Funding the government for the next several months so that Congress can come back into session and figure out a longer-term plan is generally a good thing. But I think as far as the losers are concerned, Donald Trump is now aware of what he's in for. He can't lose Republican votes. The margin is just too close. And, he's saying he has this mandate, that it was a sweep. It's true. He does have unified control in Washington right now, but unified control in the House, when you've got a margin that is as slim as it can possibly be, means that you can't pull a stunt like Elon Musk pulled, because a lot of the time you actually need a couple of Democrats on board. And so, I think Donald Trump is going to have to decide whether he wants this chaos to basically hover over almost all of the important bills that Congress is going to pass, because it looks like that's what Musk is going to do. It looks like that's what Musk thinks is a winning strategy. And at some point, I think members of Congress are going to get pretty tired of it.
Aren't there now, though, emerging about 30 Republicans who seem to be pretty consistent in their opinion that the government is simply too big and spends too much money, and that they don't really care about Donald Trump or Elon Musk, but they're going to be hawks, kind of old, kind of Tea Party Republicans, or even go back to sort of Phil Gramm era in the 1980s of government's too big and we're going to limit how much government can spend. The deficit is too important to this country. It's being ignored by both parties, and we're going to try and bring some reality back to Congress.
So that's true, except what we wind up seeing when that happens is what we saw in 2010 or 2011 after the Tea Party emerged as a decent-sized bloc in Congress, which is that strange bedfellows are made. The Republicans and this group of the Democrats and this group of small government Republicans wind up voting together, keeping the Republican majority from being able to pass the kinds of bills and legislation that they want to be able to pass. That was part of the reason that John Boehner just had to get out. He couldn't stand it anymore. Paul Ryan ultimately wound up taking over. But, it becomes difficult if a key part of one party behaves in a way that suggests that they're not willing to govern because of an issue. In this case, it might be a legitimate issue for these 30 deficit hawks. But the reality is that the rest of the Republicans and a Republican Washington can't get anything done without them on board.
So how does this break? Trump's going to want to keep in place the tax cuts that are already about to expire. He's talked about additional tax cuts. These deficit hawks have no interest in those tax cuts per se, and they want to look not only at phasing those out, but also start cutting some real spending.
Well, part of what Donald Trump is going to have to do is threaten them, which is what he does. Now, he's already identified a handful of Republicans that he claims that he will primary. And we'll see what matters more to them. Do their policy positions matter? Do their preferences matter? Does the deficit matter? Or does the threat of a primary challenge in 2 years, which would mean a candidate emerging within the next few months, matter more? And we'll see what happens on that front. But my bet is that we're not going to wind up with 30 who are willing to stand up to Donald Trump.
Okay, next step though, let's say he cuts that number in half because 15 will fear potentially being primaried, especially by the sitting president. But 15 of them, does the Republican majority doom and gloom in being able to pass their agenda?
Yeah, I mean, look, 5 of them does the Republican Party doom and gloom in terms of passing their agenda. The question becomes, are there deals that can be cut? And does Mike Johnson have the negotiating skills to get them a little bit closer to his position and get Donald Trump not to make threats and not to say the kinds of things that he typically says? There's not much evidence to suggest that Johnson has the political wherewithal to do it. We'll see what happens. But, I think as far as the Democrats are concerned, if you were going to lose the House, the Senate, and the presidency, these are the margins you want to lose by, because you get to blame the Republicans for pretty much everything that doesn't get done. And you don't have to, and in a lot of cases, you might actually be pivotal and you can keep them from getting it done.
So at about, I don't know, noon on Friday, Speaker Johnson looked dead. Looked like he would be knocked out of his seat as Speaker in the short run, and yet was able to maneuver a de facto bipartisan agreement to get this thing back on track, keep the government open, keep the holidays moving, and a deal that runs through March. Is Johnson at risk of losing his speakership as the new Congress takes hold?
I think he is. Now, I don't think this is going to be a situation where it was like Kevin McCarthy, where it's going to take 17 votes to get him elected. I think if he gets elected, people will give him a shot. They also changed the number of opposition votes that would be required to pull him and have a new vote for Speaker. But Hakeem Jeffries was very, very clear when when they brokered the final version of the bipartisan deal. And he said that he is under no circumstances going to play a role in helping Mike Johnson succeed. It was one thing when it meant keeping the government open for the last few months of the Biden presidency and over the holidays. It's another thing if Johnson thinks he can rely on any Democratic votes for any of the agenda items that the Trump administration wants to usher in. And so a handful, 2, 3, 4 Republicans that are not in support of Johnson, who decide they are going to launch their own bid, might be formidable, because all of the other Republicans out there are looking around and they know what Jeffrey said, they know what the Democrats are going to do, and they know they have to be united.
Okay, let's go to President Biden. It has not been a strong closing act, I think, in many people's view of the end of the Biden era. He changed some sentences for a few thousand. He took 37 out of 40 who were on the federal death row and made them lifetime sentences without the chance of parole. That came under criticism by the victims' families across the board, and also raising questions about, is it really the president's role to step into the judiciary's role after they've already completed exhausted their legal appeals? And there's obviously clear signs that his mental faculties are greatly diminished. Is this going to go well in the long term as those presidential scholars look back and rate the presidents? Is Joe Biden going to be in the top half of the presidents or in the bottom half?
Oh, he'll definitely be in the top half. Let me make 2 points. The first is the Constitution obviously gives Congress more power than the president. Presidents over time, and the presidency as an institution, has tried to claw back a lot of that power. But one thing that the Constitution is clear on is pardons and commuting sentences. And the reason that Joe Biden commuted the sentences of those 37 people on federal death row were twofold. First, there are issues with the federal death penalty. But second, when Donald Trump was elected and became president the first time around, he executed more people in a shorter period of time than multiple presidents, maybe than had ever been executed through the federal death penalty. I don't remember the exact statistic. And he said he was going to do it again. And so this is a president who takes law and order to a new level, and who seems to get pleasure and joy from being able to make those kinds of decisions. And so there were a lot of people. This was not just Joe Biden. There were lots of organizations out there, the American Civil Liberties Union, a lot of Democratic organizations, a lot of organizations that care about criminal justice reform, who understand especially racial disparities throughout the entire sentencing process, who were putting pressure on the president. And he had made it clear that he had qualms about the federal death penalty as well. So I don't think that that's a big surprise, especially what Donald Trump had done. The other thing that I would say is we're sort of all mired in what happened from June 27th until the election day and beyond, right? So the last 6 months of Joe Biden's presidency were problematic. But when historians look back and when presidential scholars look back, they're also going to look at the legislative accomplishments that happened over the first 2 years, and frankly, even the first 3.5 years of the administration. And I think it's important to keep in mind as well that, it's not that Joe Biden also got the United States and basically the world out of a global pandemic. And I think history is going to be a lot kinder to him than a lot of pundits and analysts are right now.
Let me push back on that. The special prosecutor investigated Joe Biden's management of presidential documents. They were stored in his garage, in offices, etc. Did not move forward with sanctions against the president, but he did outline in his report more than 2 years ago from an interview that the president was mentally deficient, that he couldn't remember basic dates, confused on basic facts, milestones in his life, including the death of his son, Beau. As presidential papers come out and date books come out and notes from meetings come out, isn't there a real concern that the president's mental faculties weren't just from the presidential debate? It's going to go back years and years. And while the staff kept everything together, Joe Biden's legacy is going to be that for the vast majority of his entire term in president, he was not functioning at a capable level.
I don't think we have any evidence of that. I really don't. We have.
Well, I just cited one.
We have a special
I just cited one that took place 2+ years ago.
So the entire so you did highlight some of the aspects of that report, but it's also important to keep in mind that in the overall context, and when that special prosecutor was asked about it later, he said that it was sort of a typical conversation with somebody who was in his 80s, that this was not a situation like we saw with Ronald Reagan. This was not a senile president who was suffering from dementia. This was somebody who, when asked about very, very specific, difficult times in his life, including the death of his son, was a little bit jumbled. And so I don't think that that's a fair characterization. The other thing that I would note is that we as a country generally draw a pretty significant distinction between the accomplishments of a presidency and the person who is president. And we see that with Reagan. We saw that with Bill Clinton. It might be the case that we see that with Joe Biden. The one other thing, I know this might not be this popular in this day and age, but to keep in mind is that Joe Biden also appointed the first woman to be, he named a woman to the ticket. He appointed the most diverse cabinet that we had ever seen. He expanded the rights of citizens across the country on a range of dimensions. And so it's not just that he got to an end of COVID. It's not just that he passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's not just that there was a major recovery act. Just across the board, he elevated the country in a way, unfortunately, that I think it's going to, retract from. But one interview with a special prosecutor who decided not to move forward with any sort of charges, I don't think is a fair characterization of the entire presidency. Now, it might be the case that in 6 months and in a year and in 2 years, we're going to learn a lot more, which is what happened with Reagan, right? People were under the assumption that he was not, all there, but no one knew how bad it was until later. And if that's the case, then I'm happy to stipulate and acknowledge that when it happens. But I don't think that we're there yet. It might come out. We'll see.
Well, David McCullough has passed away. I believe Edmund Morris is still around. We'll have one of these presidential scholars will dig in and write the quintessential biography of Biden, and we'll go from there. So
I would note one more
24
thing,
months from now, I look forward to having this discussion again.
well, one thing that I will note is that everybody learned from Reagan as well. And so, I don't know that we would see the same kind of evidence or the same kind of leaking coming out, because if an administration is going to protect a president, they're going to do a better job protecting that president. So again, we'll see.
We'll wait and see. What should people be looking for? We're headed sort of out of the holidays and into inauguration. We've seen corporations who had written off Trump, Bank of America and JP Morgan, Facebook or Meta, who had condemned the president's elect's actions relative to January 6th. They're now writing big checks for the inauguration parties. What's going to transpire over these next few weeks?
I mean, my sense is that over the course of the next few weeks, up until the inauguration on the 20th, we're going to see corporations, the media, even some voters who didn't vote for Donald Trump willing to say, all right, let's give this a shot. My bet is that on January 21st, a lot of those people are going to retract and say that they made a big mistake, because Donald Trump has told us what he is going to do. He's going to do it. I don't know why people assume that it's going to be any different than what he's promising. It might be more difficult for him to execute some of the plans that he has, but it's not like just because corporate America is backing him now that he's going to back down on some of the more controversial or offensive plans that he has. So
well,
my bet is it's going to be a short-lived honeymoon.
Certainly in a couple areas on the issue of immigration and enforcement, he can do many of those things through executive order and with existing powers. On the issue of many of the tariffs, that falls within the presidential powers as well. So those things are likely to take place. Executive orders will be signed that very first day.
Right, that's exactly what I'm talking about, which is why I'm saying that on the 21st, there might be some retraction in terms of the levels of support for him. Now there are going to, I assume that with a lot of, I don't know if you saw, colleges and universities have basically told all of their students to get back to the country before the inauguration, even if their semester starts later. There are various aspects of civil society that are sort of preparing for the worst, assuming that the kinds of things he did on day one in 2017 are going to be the kinds of things he does on day one now. The difference is that the judiciary looks a little bit different now than it did 8 years ago, and that will be helpful to him. The other thing that's important to keep in mind here too is that he is surrounding himself with people who are really very loyal to him and to his agenda. And, it's not like you're going to have somebody like Jeff Sessions to, put the brakes on any of these kinds of endeavors. So we'll see what happens. But I cannot imagine that many of the corporations and many of the media outlets that are trying to play nicely right now are going to feel that way within a week of the Trump presidency.
With that, as always, Professor Lawless, thank you very much. Stay tuned. GoLocal's got an update on a famous Providence College basketball great. Big news in his career. You can check that out on GoLocal. We've got news throughout the day. We have a major update on the former U.S. Marine, Rhode Islander, who has been alleged of running a Ponzi scheme. He now faces a new lawsuit, civil lawsuit in Massachusetts by 2 businesswomen. He faces a lawsuit in Rhode Island with 8 individuals relative to his use of their funds, and he is facing a fraud criminal charge in Rhode Island already, waiting on the state police, who have been investigating this for many, many months and raising questions about why the state police have yet to take action. For everybody, stay tuned. We'll have updates throughout. Stay safe and enjoy this great holiday weather.